Hello everyone, this is part 24 of What If Naruto Was the Perfect Shinobi, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Naruto sat against a tree on the hillside behind the Sandaim's estate. The trunk was scarred in places where he'd struck it several months earlier during his training leading into the Chunin exams. The rising sun overhead allowed him to see down well into Konoha, though the village was more or less silent save the nighttime guard Shinobi milling about the roads and buildings. A dull scraping sound was all that one could hear. The blonde Shinobi worked on his Anbu arm braca with a heated kunai, making an open socket along the armament's side, and a small crimson snake coiled on the earth next to him with a second kunai handle protruding through its mouth, while the longer Kusanagi sat straddling his lap. Naruto sensed rather than heard the presence approaching in the trees at his back, and gestured down into the village with his kunai. Look at this mess. 4 Shinobi did all that. It's amazing and ridiculous. Yamato emerged through the thin woods, with the compound's high wooden wall visible a short distance behind the captain. The Mokuton wielder was dressed in his complete Anbu mask and armor, while Naruto was clad in plain clothes. There were random scorch marks and holes mottling structures all around Konoha. To one side, an entire block was reduced to rubble. To the other, a huge ruined swath began right at the blonde's old apartment complex and traversed through the whole town in a line to the encampment wall ringing the village. The masked Anbu captain kneeled in the grass next to the Jinchuriki and likewise stared down into the destruction. You know, obsessing like this all the time won't solve a thing. You didn't call those men here and aren't to blame. Naruto chose not to respond to that and let out a breath, watching as it emerged as a white cloud and then rose and decomposed into the cold morning air. Nah, that's not quite what I was thinking about. It's a little more complicated. For as much as Naruto hated the Akatsuki quartet that had come into the village and torn Konoha apart in order to K him, he couldn't help but admire them in equal measure. Power called out to power, and the blonde had to respect a group that could waltz straight into the strongest hidden village on the continent and wreak absolute havoc and then leave more or less unscathed. More than once since then, he had wondered whether the result in his own battle might have changed had he gone all out and pushed the cursed seal to its highest level. Naruto didn't quite think so, and it both angered and enthralled him at the same time. Well, we'll be running into Akatsuki again, no doubt. That was stating the obvious. Uchiha Itachi had outright said so. Still, he appreciated the implication that the problem wasn't something he'd have to deal with on his own. His power alone wasn't enough, might never be enough to overcome the Akatsuki. Naruto could have shuddered to even think about how strong the organization's leadership would have to be, given that even the subordinates were S-class shinobi. The blonde brought his kunai down to continue work on his arm braca, but tossed it aside when it didn't cut the material, having lost too much heat due to the cold weather. Yeah, next time, things won't be the same. Naruto reached down and retrieved his other kunai. The metal handle was almost hot enough to burn his hand. The red snake sheared over and laid its head down on its master's knee, and the Jinchuriki reached down to pet its angular head with his other hand. The reptile hissed, crawling along his arm and disappearing into his sleeve, its intended purpose concluded. Never mind that, I'm not quite here to socialize. You've been given a new mission. The blonde Anbu looked at his captain and almost smirked as he began smoothing his rough handiwork with the hot metal blade. I thought I was supposed to be resting. Though in truth, he had gotten more rest than he could ever want. Naruto had spent close to a week bedridden due to his most recent beating, locked down under guard while the Hokage's personal medic treated his various maladies. He also hadn't been outside Konoha in close to 6 months, not counting his battle with Kimimaro, and would be more than pleased to go out on a mission and get to see the world again, even though he remained more than a little battered and bruised. Yamato then gave out a little detail. This time it's not a combat assignment. You'll be working along with Sarutobi-sama to locate and retrieve an important person. That sounded boring, but Naruto didn't mind that seeing as he would be guarding the third. However, the more he considered it, as his captain allowed him to, the odder the mission seemed. The Hokage never went out on routine assignments. The Jinchuriki likewise hadn't missed Yamato calling the Sandaime, Sarutobi, rather than using his proper TLE. A lead ball settled into the blonde's stomach, but he decided to lead Yamato into giving him the answer rather than going on an assumption. TCH, that doesn't sound like something the Hokage ought to be doing, unless you're quick. Indeed, the Sandaime Hokage has retired and has volunteered to bring Tsunadheim, his chosen successor, back to the village. Naruto placed the Kusanagi on the ground and rose with a grunt and looked around, at last spotting a tall spruce tree that looked to be in similar shape to the one he had been resting against. He launched his kunai at the worn trunk without warning, and the heated metal missile embedded into the hardwood with a loud thwack. The damaged tree then started to creak and break apart, but Yamato made several rapid hand seals, and the wood mended together again, twisting around the kunai. The Jinchuriki paid no mind, thoughts spinning with his new predicament. A new Hokage meant having to kneel to another person that wasn't Sarutobi, and that wasn't something Naruto wanted to accept. Yamato ignored his subordinate's ill-tempered response, showing no reaction as though he had known in advance that the blonde wouldn't react well to the news. The masked man spared Naruto one last glance as he moved to leave. Go to the east gate at noon, and be sure to dress like a civilian. No visible combat gear. The captain then disappeared with Shunshin, giving the soured Jinchuriki no room to lodge the gripe that he was preparing to deliver. Naruto cursed again and leaned over to take the Kusanagi back into his hand. The straight blade shortened in response to his will to about 2 standard kunai lengths. He sheathed the shortened weapon into the socket he'd made in his braca and then strapped the armament to his wrist. The blonde practiced drawing the sword several times until he was pleased with his work and the speed with which he could retrieve it at his wrist, while not impeding his ceiling. A new Hokage, bar. Naruto scowled with distaste and covered his braca with his robe sleeve, and then began to climb the inclined path towards the third estate once more. Not until he reached the rear gate that Jinchuriki did he realize that he had no clothes to wear at all because his old apartment had been obliterated. Nor did he have a single ryo to purchase more with, as his wallet and all his savings had been washed out with the tide. XXXXXXXXXX. Returning to the village hours later and seeing the devastation up close and personal did little to improve Naruto's mood. Neither did the angered glares and the near-tangible hatred that the civilian horde seemed to direct at him, though not all did so, but some had even looked to be enraged enough to be willing to attack him. Naruto guessed that the reason behind Akatsuki's attack had somehow been leaked to the entire village. At that point the Jinchuriki had pulled out the Kusanagi and extended the blade to a more lethal length, while activating his Jun enough to put a genuine scare into them. The glaring townspeople had scattered like roaches in his wake, leaving him alone on the emptied road, advancing towards Konoha's eastern gate with sword in hand. Naruto. The blonde slowed his pace when he heard Kiba's voice shout out behind him, placing his weapon back in its custom socket as he reached the gate, as he no longer needed it. There were now 3 masked Anbu stationed at the side gate in addition to the usual Chunin guards. The village was taking extra precautions in Akatsuki's wake. Konoha's huge main gate had an entire squadron, in addition to a Junin supervisor to oversee the regulars. Naruto came to a gradual stop and leaned against a power pole, allowing the mutt to catch up with him while he covered the Kusanagi with his sleeve again, glancing towards him with his peripheral vision. Mutt, I've got a mission, no time to chat. The Inuzuka reached up and scratched behind his head. Right, me too, a search and retrieval assignment or some s. I was also ordered not to bring a Kamaru. That tidbit set the blonde's suspicions on high alert, and he turned his head to see that Kiba was likewise wearing civilian clothes. And so he would be the third person assigned to this little escapade. Naruto couldn't argue much, as despite the mutt's overall inexperience, his nose was rated among the best in his clan. Yet still, there were several more seasoned trackers in Anbu and elsewhere that could handle the mission's role. The third's sometimes sentimental nature had come into the equation somewhere, Naruto knew, to reunite the 2 genin teammates. Though in truth, he supposed it didn't matter much. That's good, I guess. As he cracked his N against the pole, the Jinchuriki wondered when talking with the mutt had become so damned awkward. The loudmouth was standing there, attempting to make small talk and not being able to come up with a single word, and Naruto could do no better. The blonde thought that perhaps Kiba had gotten wise about the little incident between him and Hana and was restraining his anger to avoid taking an ass beating, but he soon doubted it. The mutt didn't have that much restraint, and Naruto would have seen right through the attempt. The simple truth was that the blonde's new station in Anbu had planted him in another world relative to his old schoolmate. There was now so much less common ground between them, and both teenage shinobi knew it. He'd waited so long to be able to corner the blonde, and hadn't had a thing to tell him when he'd gotten his chance. "Ah, we're all here, I see, good." Sarutobi's voice spared Naruto and Kiba the need to continue the awkward charade. The Jinchuriki wouldn't have even recognized the retired Hokage had the man not spoken. The Sandaime was dressed in a simple white traveler's robe with a wide straw hat, and leaned ever so little against a gnarled walking stick. Yugao was with him, in a loose kimono with her katana stored in her sash, though she didn't appear all that much like a kunoichi despite being armed. Naruto ceased his slouching and snapped to attention in response to their arrival. The purple-haired vice-captain meanwhile stared over at the ogling Kiba with ill-concealed disapproval. She didn't like the Inuzuka, stemming back to the attitude he'd shown during the third exam preliminaries, and Naruto was sure she couldn't be all too pleased with having to take a genin on her mission regardless. The container raked a hand through his hair and palmed his brow in irritation. "Ugh, stop drooling, mutt. That's so embarrassing." The Sandaime made towards the gate, and the blonde stood and watched as the old man spoke to the guards. Yugao spared Kiba a quick glance, sent the leering teenager a severe and borderline revolted look, and turned to the Jinchuriki. "There's no use in blaming him, Naruto. Little puppies can't help digging themselves into holes. You seem to have recovered well." Kiba reddened as Yugao strode straight past him, dismissing him on the spot, either in rage or humiliation, or perhaps both. His nostrils widened in anger and he growled under his breath at the Anbu's back as she passed and stood closer to Naruto. The blonde pitied him ever so little but said nothing to support him, having no interest in being lured into some immature spat with the Sandaime present. "I'm alright, other than a bruised ego, at least." No matter how strong Kisame was, or how dangerous the Akatsuki were, Naruto still resented getting his ass beaten into the ground. As Yugao came closer, he noticed that her stride was a bit tense, even though she looked to be all healed. A sked shinobi medic could work some miracles, but serious internal damage still took its own time to heal, and she'd taken as bad a beating at that bastard shark's hands as he had. The medics had healed her more grievous external wounds, however, and a subtle henge seemed to be covering the remainder well enough. The reassuring hand that came down onto Naruto's shoulder was warm despite the winter cold. "You did much better than expected, so don't act so humiliated. Few people could have even survived against such a man." The bitterness in the kunoichi's voice showed that her thoughts were more or less running parallel to his, and with reason, he supposed. Kisame had smacked them both around, but Naruto had at least still been standing in the end. Yugao was a veteran, at least relative to the blonde-haired teen, as well as his direct superior, but he had been the one protecting her in the end rather than the opposite. She was a proud woman, and was no more pleased with the battle than he was. Still, Naruto was Jinchuriki. He existed to K his enemies. Failure was a bitter pill to swallow, because this time he had no excuse. Naruto relaxed into his vice-captain's grip and crossed his arms with a glower, and his robe sleeve slid down to uncover the sword girded at his wrist. "Next time, we'll butcher him. And there will be a next time." Yugao showed a rather vicious smile, and moved her hand down to caress the Kusanagi's length. Orochimaru's weapon shimmered and warmed against Naruto's wrist in response to her touch, but it didn't burn her as it had Kisame when he'd grabbed it. The blonde thought the entire phenomenon to be a mite disturbing. However, the short moment, or whatever it could have been called, was then ruined when Kiba's rough voice howled out in anger behind them. The mutt didn't seem to be taking well to being ignored. "Oi!" Naruto pulled his wrist loose and turned back to Kiba with an irritated expression. The Jinchuriki was given little chance to speak, though, because the returning Sarutobi's exasperated voice cut in instead. Yugao's palm was on her katana's handle, and she looked to be almost itching to carve out a certain barking dog's tongue. "That'll be enough now, we all need to work together to complete this mission." The blonde couldn't help but notice how haggard the old man still sounded. Naruto hadn't seen the third all that much since the meeting in which he'd gotten demoted. A month had almost passed since Orochimaru's invasion, and Sarutobi still hadn't recovered. Yes, Hokage-sama. The Sandaime sent Naruto a strange look and seemed to be about to respond, but chose not to and instead shook his head. Kiba grinned through his teeth, and the two unmasked Anbu nodded in stereo, looking at one another, and then back to the old man. The squad began moving towards the now opening gate, with Yugao maneuvering right into the point position. Naruto slowed his normal mission pace somewhat to keep even with his now retired mentor, while the mutt moved a little behind the blonde Jinchuriki. Soon enough, the team exited the village and stopped along a side road that led to the south. The third gave his squad their instructions as some non-shinobi travelers passed them. Here, now listen. First, we'll make haste towards Tsunad's last known whereabouts. Like most plans, this one was nothing complex in nature. Their current destination was a little entertainment town called Otafukugai, located about a dozen or so kilometers to Konoha's southeast. Naruto knew the place well, having haunted the small village on a regular basis during his pre-Genin excursions, as its closeness to Konoha and less than moral, but rich, visitors made it an ideal hunting ground. Prostitution and gambling prospered in the little hole, and the place attracted all sorts. The team would head there to retrieve Tsunade, assuming she was still present, or else track her scent to wherever she'd gone since, as she'd been spotted there within the last week. Sarutobi seemed to have something or another that had once belonged to the Slug Princess, though Naruto didn't much care. Tracking her was the mutt's problem. He was there as a guard. Naruto, a moment. The blonde stopped and looked at Sarutobi once the explanation was complete and both Yugao and Kiba started down the road. The latter halted as well and glanced back at the retired Hokage and his teenage protege with a curious expression, but the Sandaime motioned him on down the road, at which point the Genin shrugged and complied. The third reached into his robes and pulled out what appeared to be a plain-looking scroll. Hold on to this scroll until we've located Tsunade. There's something important within. Sarutobi held the scroll out in his hand, and Naruto accepted it without question. The rookie Anbu examined the strange docent, but he wasn't all too interested in it until he glimpsed the complicated seal binding the scroll shut. He looked to the old man to request an explanation, but the Sandaime had turned and started back down the path on his own. Naruto chomped on his lip and placed the scroll inside his own robe, and then ran to meet stride with his squad. Strange. The scroll came to rest against the scar tissue covering the blonde's heart. Naruto thought no more about it as he began to concentrate on the road ahead. XXXXXXXXXXX. An attractive, slate-haired woman emerged into the setting sunlight, shutting the roadside motel's cheap curtain entrance behind her. She moved with a slight lurch in her steps, making towards an open-air restaurant a couple buildings down. The woman lumbered into the place and glanced around the room with a squint, at last succeeding in locating her companion, giving no particular heed to the lecherous stares that some patrons were sending her. A tall, muscular man with bronzed skin and peppered hair sat alone at a table in the corner, munching on a yakitori skewer. He hailed the woman over when he noticed her presence, shouting over the din in the restaurant. Awake at last, he. Come on over here and have a seat, sweetheart. The woman took her seat, pursing her lips in silent disapproval at the loud tone, and the huge man grinned as he picked his pointed teeth with the now used chicken skewer. A long, thick wooden pole with a knapsack tied onto the end was leaning against the wall next to him, its handles situated within reaching distance. There were several large serving plated on the table, some emptied and some not. The man had ordered enough entrees to put the proprietor's children through school, or so it appeared. You make a real cute girl, Itachi-san. I think I'm getting a little hard over here. The woman, Uchiha Itachi under a henge, might have glared a hole through the likewise disguised Kisame, except that the strain would have caused his vision to start burning again. The genius had to acknowledge that he'd gone overboard during the late raid on his home village. 3 Mangekyo usages in quick succession had put the renegade Uchiha into a near coma, not that he'd had much choice in the latter 2 instances. He'd much rather have met his end in battle than risk being captured and put to tea and eventual execution. Itachi replied in his usual dull murmur as he also leaned in close to his grinning partner, though it didn't quite sound the same as usual given his present disguise. A knowing observer might have remarked on how similar the Uchiha looked, and sounded, to his deceased mother. Don't speak our names in public like that. The last thing we need is to be recognized now. Kisame placed his toothpick back onto his emptied plate and wiped his mouth using his robe sleeve. Both Henjid Akatsuki members were dressed in simple linen peasants' robes, as opposed to the usual cloud-patterned ensemble. Those robes were instead being repaired and cleaned at the area seamstress shop. Kisame in particular had gotten his clothes ruined in his battle with Uzumaki Naruto. Said swordsman shoved his yakitori plate to the middle and reached towards a bowl that was heaped over with seasoned rice noodles. The disguised Kisame dug in with thin, cheap wooden chopsticks that looked ridiculous in his mammoth hand, and shoveled an enormous bite into his waiting mouth. He took his time in chewing and swallowing his noodles, showing civilized table manners despite his sometimes brutish attitude and all the time brutish appearance. Kisame pointed at his partner with his chopsticks, grinning once he had cleared his maw. You obsess over things too much. No one gonna catch us out in this little shoal. The non-shark's grumbling voice was low enough that the locals in the restaurant didn't hear his slight towards their town, which was indeed a little hole in the earth. Located on a minor road leading east and west, to Konoha's south. Itachi crushed down the impulse to pick at his itching chest as he ran an irritated hand through his stone-colored hair, the most emotion he was willing to show. Kisame went right back to devouring his meal rather than awaiting a response. Itachi stared at him and waited until he cleaned his last platter, and then summoned the waiter with a silent hand gesture. Fine. Behave until we leave, and I'll cover the bill. Kisame's grin widened into a leer, and rather than requesting the check as Itachi had planned, he proceeded to order several more expensive entrees. The Uchiha almost made a comment, but then thought better about it as he relented to the inevitable and ordered an herbal tea. Minutes passed in silence, and then the waiter returned with Itachi's tea and more platters, among which was a whole roasted duck. Kisame reached over and tore loose a drumstick, took a huge bite, and spoke again once he had swallowed it. The man's razor teeth crushed right through the bone, and he swallowed that along with the meat, attracting some incredulous stares among the other diners in the process. I'm a bit surprised the leader hasn't called another big meeting, not that I'm all that keen on having to explain how we lost the kid. Itachi sipped at his tea, and the pain in his disguised Sharingan lessened a bit as its medicinal vapors rose into them. He wasn't in the least surprised, as his most recent meeting with his mentor, done via the transmission jutsu while Kisame was in the bath, had allowed the genius to learn what was happening. Sasori had long since taken his leave, citing a need to return to his personal workshop and repair the broken puppets he'd managed to salvage in the raid. Itachi debated in his mind whether or not to share his knowledge with his partner, and decided that there was no harm in it. Kakazu and Hiden still haven't reported back in. He won't begin the extraction process on the Ichibi until then. The Uchiha sat and continued to drink while Kisame digested the news. For his own part, he couldn't have cared less about what might have happened to Kakazu and Hiden. Their mission shouldn't have had complications, as Orochimaru had been reported to be rather more than alive, with his organization likewise in ruin. However, Itachi didn't at all like that something had gone wrong nonetheless, as that meant that he had somehow made an error in his predictions. This was a problem to him, and one that had the potential to be quite dangerous one given the people involved. One couldn't make such mistakes when dealing with cage-level shinobi. At least we got that one. Itachi nodded his solemn agreement and stared down into his near-emptied glass. There will be other chances to capture Naruto-kun. The mission was still a success. At that moment, as though the heavens above were somehow acting in agreement with his statement, a small group came traveling down the road outside the restaurant. Kisame recognized them at once, or at least one person in the group, as he reached towards his pole and knapsack, same hadder under a henge, and began to rise with a barbaric grin. His hunger was cast to the side as his other appetite emerged to take its place. Itachi had his back to the entrance and didn't see the new arrivals then, but the Uchiha moved to stand regardless, intent on checking whatever move his impulsive partner was planning. Well, now it will be. Itachi moved right into Kisame's path as he trailed the shark's gaze into the street. The Konoha missing nin blinked several times in response to what he saw, to be sure that neither his impaired vision nor the receding sunlight were causing him to see things. However, it turned out to be no mirage, and the genius acknowledged that Uzumaki Naruto was indeed prowling down the street outside the present location, right alongside an armed Azuki Yugao-san, and an old man in a robe and bamboo hat that had to be none other than Sarutobi Sasuke, the Sandaime Hokage. Yet another teenager seemed to be traveling with them as well, but Itachi didn't recognize him on sight. However, The red markings on his cheeks tagged him as an Inuzuka. Kisum shouldered his thick traveling pole using his one good hand and moved to step around Itachi, who again moved into his path and pinned the rogue Kirin with the harshest stare he could muster in his strained condition. No. Kisum's skin began to revert to its natural blue color as his concentration lapsed in his rage, and Itachi continued in a quiet tone, so that he wouldn't be overheard, rather than giving the enraged swordsman time to roar out whatever complaint he had on his tongue. The Uchiha was aware that his and Kisum's sudden movements had attracted more than a little attention inside the open-air place. At the same time, Naruto and his companions stopped in the road outside, and the tall Jinchuriki turned his stare straight at the two Akatsuki dining inside, sensing their looks on him, and in particular the malicious intent in the grudged swordsman's leer. Itachi almost smirked, impressed with the blonde's perceptiveness, but kept his attention concentrated on his partner. An ignorant observer might have laughed at the scene, a small woman staring down a massive older man and cowing him into submission, not in the least knowing the danger associated with it. Inciting a rash battle isn't the wisest option in our present condition. The outcome isn't guaranteed this time. Itachi sat back down in his seat, convinced that his words were true, even though he had his own personal reasons not to pursue Naruto at that moment also. The Sharingan master knew that he would be more or less useless in a serious combat at that moment, as he couldn't so much as even activate his dojutsu at its normal level without crippling pain. Furthermore, Kisum was still quite wounded in his own right. The burns on his hand due to grabbing a white-hot kusanagi hadn't staunched, and his shoulder wound could reopen in a battle. Neither was visible at the moment due to the shark man's henge, but the renegade Uchiha knew. Kisum began to see sense when he recognized that Itachi wasn't going to support him, and reclaimed his seat and resumed gorging on his meal, unwilling to go it alone against both a cage as well as a Jinchuriki who would battle to his death to protect the old man. However, he still voiced his soured opinion in a louder tone than needed given the shinobi lurking in the street, spitting meat out onto their table, manners neglected in anger. Then we're going to let them go right on down the damned road. This chance dropped into our laps, and I think we should take it. Kisum's logic moved Itachi not a bit. The Uchiha had his own designs, and he wouldn't permit his overzealous partner to ruin them. Meanwhile, the Konoha quartet had since halted their progress and were engaged in a conversation in the street. A long moment passed in silence. Azuki Yugao at last parted ranks and headed alone towards the same motel that the Akatsuki pair had rented a room in, while the three male shinobi marched right in the direction, into the restaurant. Seeing them coming through the entrance, Itachi stood and moved into another seat, next to Kisum rather than across the table. He now had his back against the nearest wall as well, so that he could continue observing Naruto and his companions. The host directed the Konoha nin, who were all dressed in plain clothes and showing no shinobi adornments whatsoever, to a table in the restaurant's opposite corner. The blonde shirred right into the seat against the wall on his side as well, and proceeded to level his burning gaze straight onto the woman and man sitting across the establishment. So, he suspects us in particular. Not bad, Naruto-kun. Itachi seed her head in what he believed to be a demure manner and returned Naruto's glowering stare with a disarming smile, a gesture that was almost alien to the ever-stoic Nukanen and looked the part, and perhaps served to incite his suspicions more as a result. Kisum was less diplomatic in his response, and returned the glare in equal measure, no doubt willing the blonde to do something that would give him an excuse to move against Itachi's wishes. Naruto averted his gaze soon enough, and ordered his meal. The supper-time crowd began to thin out, and the restaurant became quieter as its regular patrons departed in increasing numbers. Kisum grinned and began to eat with vigor once more, reveling in his W and over the Jinchuriki. Yugao entered moments later and took her seat between the Hokage and the Inuzuka kid, with her back turned to the two notorious missing nin. Sarutobi was in the other chair against the wall, with all three Konoha nin lodged between him and the other customers. An attacker would thus have to make it past them all to reach the old man, and Naruto would have the initiative due to his position, no doubt how the blonde had planned it. I still can't believe that Punk's sitting right there, and we're not doing a thing about it. This time, Itachi ignored Kisum's grumbling outright, and instead continued to direct his undivided attention towards the group across the restaurant. Naruto and the third spoke in low tones so that eavesdropping on their conversation was impossible, while the much louder Inuzuka kid chatted up their waitress as she served the drinks and appetizers. The missing nin's attentiveness soon paid dividends, however, when the girl had gone back to her work and the Inuzuka entered into the conversation at hand. The Uchiha was able to overhear the careless genin teenager speak the name, Tsunade-sama. The smallest smirk crossed her lips in reaction to the word. Ah, then that's how it is, that explains much. Using this new tidbit and his brilliant mind, Itachi was able to piece together the general scenario in an accurate manner. The Hokage would never leave his village with such a meager escort. 2 Anbu and a genin, which indicated that Sarutobi had either resigned his position or had been dismissed. And now he was on a personal mission to retrieve the slug princess Tsunade, which would likewise indicate that she was to be his successor as Hokage. The Sannin wasn't with the group, and so she still hadn't been located, which meant that Naruto and the others would remain outside Konoha a while longer. These latest events suited Itachi's aims quite well, and Kisame quirked a peppered brow when he glimpsed his partner's poised expression. Itachi glanced back at the Konoha nin one more time, and then returned his sore gaze to Kisame as he explained while sipping at his remaining tea, which had since gone lukewarm. For now, we shall trail them to their destination at a distance. There will be time to make a solid plan once that's done. Kisame nodded with a grunt. The plan wasn't as direct or combative as the shark might have liked, but he seemed to realize that it was the best compromise he would get and made no complaint about it. The same nin gorged on his last dish, and Itachi called to request a check, lest his partner decide to dig even deeper into his pocketbook in his ill humor. And besides, loitering around the restaurant too long was bound to attract even more suspicion. The rogue Sharingan user reached into his robes to withdraw enough ryo to cover the bill and leave a generous tip, and then rose to leave, allowing Kisame to lead in order to watch him and make certain he did nothing to provoke trouble. The Kiri nin hoisted his henged weapon onto his shoulder, simulating more strain in doing so than he might ever had even with a wounded arm, inviting Itachi to move to help him set his knapsack while groaning aloud about having a bad back. You've got an admirer now, cutie. The Uchiha looked at his chuckling partner as the muscle-bound swordsman lumbered into the street and arched a brow without expression. Kisame grinned and motioned back into the restaurant using his shoulder, and Itachi turned in the same direction, to see the Inuzuka teen looking right at her, with a pink tinge in his cheeks. The stoic Nukanen ignored the lurch that ran through his stomach, and attempted to smile and make a polite bow. Naruto no longer seemed to be concerned with him at all, and was instead preoccupied with picking at his kuva salad while holding a conversation with his kunoichi comrade. The Inuzuka leered and smirked in response to the attention, and Itachi tossed his long slate hair over his shoulder and exited, waving over his shoulder. No doubt the teen could have smelled out his real gender beneath the henge in another place, but the prevailing odors inside a restaurant made such a thing more or less impossible to even the best trained nose. Things are still going according to his plan. Uchiha Itachi stepped out into the cold night air with that thought on his mind and stared into the moon shining bright overhead. As he returned with Kisame to their room, he resolved to make certain that he succeeded in his own mission. XXXXXXXXXX. Later on that night, Naruto sat cross-legged on his bed inside the group's compact motel room. There were 3, and Kiba was sound asleep on one. The third was relaxing in a hot bath in the connected restroom, and Yugao stood guard outside the door. The mutt's low snores broke the silence in the small room. The Jinchuriki thought the place was a low-rent dive that wasn't suited to accommodate a Hokage, past or present, but Sarutobi hadn't complained. Naruto let out an irritated grunt and slammed back hard onto his mattress. Might as well go outside, I guess. Naruto cracked his shoulders and made 3 shadow clones to guard the room in his place, and reached into his robe to retrieve the 3rd scroll. Naruto tossed the docent to a clone so that he wouldn't have to keep it on him. Sarutobi had placed a paper fuinjutsu on the single window that should prevent intruders, but there was no harm in taking extra precaution. He snorted at Kiba, who responded in his sleep with the same, and made towards the exit. As soon as he emerged into the hall, a katana was poised straight on his heart. He raised his hands in a disarming gesture, and Yugao sighed and removed the blade, and held it in at her side. You should sleep. Tomorrow we'll all need to be at our best. He wished that he could, but he had too much on his mind. The mission, an unwanted new Hokage, the Akatsuki attack on Konoha, and that strange king intent he'd sensed prior to supper were all whirling around in the blonde's mind. Naruto edged around Yugao and plopped down onto a worn leather couch that sat skewed against the wall near the room he'd exited a moment earlier, between his door and the next. Too restless to sleep, and the mutt snores too loud. I was losing it in there. Yugao glanced down the hall in both directions, to make certain that no one could listen in on their conversation. I checked into those two suspicious people in the restaurant a while ago. The hostess here knew nothing that suggested undercover shinobi, even with incentive. Naruto reclined to lie down on the couch and nested his blonde spikes against the armrest with a slight grin. Incentive, in Azuki speak, could have meant a bribe, or perhaps inventive threats, to outright tea an interrogation. He had no doubts that the motel's hostess hadn't seen or heard a thing, because Yugao would have uncovered it. The Anbu Jinchuriki was embarrassed to admit it, but he had to acknowledge that he'd perhaps gotten a little too overzealous in pegging the two travelers as threats. I must have been mistaken. I watched them through dinner and didn't see a thing either. Still, he was certain that he'd sensed some king intent back there, and no mere itinerant laborer could have created enough to get his attention. Perhaps he'd gotten too paranoid in response to recent events, with both Akatsuki and Orochimaru messing with him. Either that or the two were very good at hiding themselves in plain sight. Naruto had more than once that night considered rushing into their room and killing him as a precaution, but Sarutobi would never have condoned such outright and the old man was the retrieval team's leader. No matter, it's better to be too suspicious than not enough, since the Hokage is with us. Naruto crossed his arms and stared at the ceiling, responding with a sour grumble. You mean, ex-Hokage? Yugao glanced at her most time subordinate, but simple equal teammate in this particular mission. You don't sound all too pleased about the Sandaim's retirement. Neither am I. The Jinchuriki sat up and reclined back against the couch. Naruto held his tongue a short moment in an attempt to determine whether the purple-haired martinet was angling to ensnare him in some insubordinate conduct. However, he soon hurled that suspicious notion aside, dismissing it as rampant paranoia, and answered in an honest, though moderated statement. I'm not wild about it. I got into Anbu to serve him, not some other person. Yugao nodded and sheathed her katana, and made towards Naruto's spot. The Jinchuriki made room on the couch to let her sit down, but the woman instead chose to perch on the armrest next to him. She replied to the container's non-committal grousing in a less indirect manner, while Naruto scooted over towards the couch's center a bit more to avoid getting hit with the sheathed katana resting at her waist. Well, I'm not bothered so much that he's chosen to repose, but the person he's nominated to succeed him sickens me. Naruto almost cringed in reaction to the blunt ending statement and glanced back at the room's shut door, as though expecting the third to come out and lambast his two team members. Nothing like that happened, however. Naruto had no particular problem with Tsunade, other than that she wasn't Sarutobi. The container's issue with her being made Hokage both started and ended with that one simple truth. Other than that, he was inclined to trust his mentor's decision without much question or argument. As both a Sannin member and the Shodai Hokage's granddaughter, the Slug Princess had both the skills and the shinobi pedigree to make an ideal Hokage, at least in the village's perspective. Not that this made Naruto even the least bit more willing to accept her as his leader. I don't know about that, she was in the Sannin, and the first's last descendant. The vice-captain didn't take her companion's ambivalence well. Yugao's tone turned downright glacial, and Naruto then realized that she was even more put out with this mission and its potential consequences than he was, and that he would be the one to have to weather her ice storm. He would have loved to have been able to toss the mutt out here and make a quick retreat, but that wasn't an option. A lineage that she spits on through her actions. Tsunade is a deserter and a coward. She's abandoned her sworn responsibilities once in the past, and she'll do it again. A leader needs more than raw power, and she doesn't have the dedication. Making her Hokage is a disgrace to us all. As a samurai's daughter, Yugao was a strict traditionalist. She told the Jinchuriki a little about her childhood on a patrol one night. As such, Naruto imagined that her respect issues towards the Slug Princess centered on her dishonoring her storied ancestors with her conduct, in particular her abandoning Konoha, the Shodai's village, and squandering her inheritance on sake and gambling chips. That and she had little tolerance towards people she perceived to be cowards and derelicts. Naruto exhaled a breath once she ended her short diatribe, not in the least willing to contradict her, and perhaps even agreeing a little. He didn't resent Tsunde's abandoning Konoha, as he too had entertained the same notion countless times in the past, but he did concur that a technical Nukenon wasn't a person that ought to be made Hokage. I'm not even convinced she'll accept the position. Tsunade doesn't seem to want to have much to do with Konoha. That question would be decided quite soon. According to Kiba, Tsunade's scent was growing stronger along the trail, which meant that he and the others were gaining on her. At the present pace, the team should overtake the Sannin tomorrow sometime. Yugao crossed her arms and looked to the side, tossing her long hair over her shoulder. Her bad mood seemed to be subsiding. I should hope not. I do not respect or trust her, and I have no wish to work under her. Naruto kept his own counsel, as he had nothing to add to that. Soon enough, the silence pervading the dim and narrow hall became borderline oppressive, and the Anbu Kunoichi looked down at the ground, porcelain cheeks tinged pink with embarrassment. Yugao let out an apologetic sigh and addressed the Jinchuriki in a less hostile tone. I spoke in error. I should not have behaved in such an unbecoming manner. Assuming Tsunade Hime accepts the village's nomination, she will become our commander. The mission requires us both to serve and protect her with our lives. Forgive me. The demon vessel blinked, not having expected in the least to be apologized to. Her comments hadn't bothered him in the least, even though he hadn't agreed with them all. Rather, he'd been a bit pleased that she was willing to be that open with him. The container sure as hell wouldn't air his gripes to someone he didn't trust, and he was much less proper than Yugao. Naruto shrugged and waved the apologies aside. No need. I never signed over the right to have an opinion when I got into the Corps. Neither did you, unless the procedures have changed. Yugao shook her head and chuckled under her breath at the irreverent teenager. Hey, the others were on the mark about one thing. You were a loose cannon. Naruto grinned right back at her, taking on a rare ingratiating tone. The vessel supposed he'd earned that moniker well enough, having broken standing orders on 2 important missions now, something he never would have even considered doing prior to being made Anbu. He'd saved people important to him on both occasions, though, and would repeat either without a second's hesitation, in the same manner that he knew that the Hokage and even his captain would send him again. You wouldn't change me, though. Rather than making some snappish retort in response to his bait, she surprised the Jinchuriki again and nodded. That's true, I wouldn't. You're a good shinobi, and an asset to the Hokage. For all he'd accomplished during his short-lived but active career, Uzumaki Naruto still had no real idea how to take a compliment, and averted his blue stare down the darkened hall. He reverted back to being snide, as he still tended to do on occasion when something managed to catch him with his guard down. That's too damned kind. You're making me blush now. Yugao remained silent a moment, and then stood and stared down at her sitting blonde companion with a cold, imperious expression, arms crossed under her chest and lips pressed into a thin, tight line. Naruto tensed a little and prepared to dodge a possible incoming smack. However, when the expected reprimand came out, it held a noticeable insincere undertone. HMPH, don't sound too pleased. You're also still an ignorant grunt and a braggart, with reprehensible sword skills and poor stealth. Naruto reached behind his head and scratched, letting out a dark chuckle. There we go, now that sounds a little more like it. The purple-haired swordswoman tilted her head and opened her mouth, but she said nothing, and then changed gears on the spot as she drew her katana again and used the long king's sword's point to gesture towards their motel room's still-shut entrance. Naruto trailed the elegant weapon towards the door and cracked his N, sending a pleasant shudder running through his senses. It's getting late now. Go to bed, Naruto. The blonde was getting a bit dazed, now that she mentioned sleep again. The conversation had more or less sapped his ill humor. He nodded and rose, making back towards the room. As Naruto placed his hand on the brass knob and began to turn, the now quite tired Jinchuriki glanced back over his shoulder at the older Kunoichi. Fine. You should get some sleep too, though. She didn't even look at him as she reclaimed her previous guard spot against the wall. I've long since gotten used to late nights. This is nothing. Now, go. Naruto nodded and entered the room, shutting the door behind him, though he didn't lock it. As soon as he was gone, Yugao let out a long, exasperated sigh and looked down at her med-lover's keepsake. The Anbu slid down the wall to sit prone on the carpet and cradled the ice-cold metal against her brow. However, The masterpiece sword steel embrace did little to warm the woman's lonesome, wearied consciousness on this particular winter's night. She stood again, cast one last lingering glance back towards the cracked door, and at last returned to her silent nighttime vigil with blade in hand. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.